Hello everyone, Todd Shellnut with CFI Pro Courses, and today is going to be the first of many videos that are going to be tailored to customer request. So if you have made a request in the past for me to go over a particular subject, well, this is where this is going to start. I'm going to try to do at least 1 to 2 of these a week going forward. These will be more detailed items that are only available on my Patreon. So YouTubers will not get this, other platforms will not get this. And hopefully this will be able to help you to better see where you need to be as an instructor instead of trying to act like a commercial pilot. So today we're going to be discussing airspace. Now, what is the biggest problem that I see in regards to new CFIs trying to teach airspace? Well, they're still trying to talk about it as if they're a commercial pilot. So please make sure that you do not try to talk about this as if you are a commercial pilot, because you are trying to train someone who doesn't know about these items. So the most common way that I see this taught incorrectly is for the CFI applicant to go right down the line in alphabetical order. They'll talk about A, they'll talk about B, C, and so on. And when they're doing it, they're just covering the items that are in the PTS. They are going right down the list. They are giving literally what is in the PTS, but they're not teaching it. So they're talking about it, but they're not teaching it. So I'm going to very briefly go through with you. And again, this is something that I personally think that if I were going to teach airspace to a person, this would be a 2-event class. I would have one class which I'm going to present to you today, and then I'm going to kind of abbreviate what I would do in a second class setting. I don't think this is something I can present all in one class setting. So I break this down into 2 1-hour segments. That way I don't have brain matter all over the back of the classroom wall, and people are actually listening to what I'm saying. Now, in order to properly teach this airspace, I will need a VFR sectional, so I will have that on the screen, and I'm going to be going by that. I'm also going to share with you how I put together my little note cards that I have my students put together themselves, and the data that I have put on those cards. And you're going to see it's not that hard when we actually start talking about it, but just like with anything else in aviation, when we're trying to teach it, we have to have a good solid foundation. So we're going to start with a foundation level airspace item, and then we're going to build off of that. So I'm just going to be talking as if I were giving a class. If I need to abbreviate something, I will say, all right, so at this time I would talk about this. Like, I'm not going to teach you about like VFR weather minimums or cloud clearances or anything like that. You already know that. You're a commercially rated pilot. You don't need to hear me tell you that it's 3 statute miles and 1,000-foot ceilings and 1,000 foot above, 500 foot below, 2,000 foot from. So this is where I'm going to go with it. All right. So without further ado, let's get started, and we'll look at the PTS. We'll see what it says. We'll also look at the private and commercial ACS and see what that says, which is really not a lot. And then we'll also double back to the lesson. So we'll kind of be bouncing around a little bit, but I'm going to show you at first off why I'm doing what I'm doing. So first off, let's take a look at the CFI PTS. Okay, so if I were teaching it nowadays in the new digital age, I would have this particular screen up on either my Apple TV or on my computer, or maybe I'm using a specific program like ForeFlight or WingX. In this particular case, I'm going to be using this great website here called SkyVector. And this is good for me because I can project this up onto a screen. I can load this, have this onto a computer because it's a website that makes it easier to work with. Now, I like to have this particular area right here, and I'm just going to let you know where I'm coming from. This is the the Atlanta area here, and I like to work within this area because it has every one of the airspaces that I want to talk about. And I start off knowing exactly which airports I'm going to start teaching airspace from. And the reason why I like this one is because there is this airport here, which is what I always start off on, which is Ashland, Lineville. Sometimes I may pick Roanoke, just depends on what I'm doing. But for today's purposes, we're going to pick Ashland. And again, because I've taught this so many times, I know this is where I want to go. I know this is my setup. So let's go ahead and start with an airspace lesson. So before we do that, let's just go ahead and pull up the CFI PTS. Let's briefly review that and see what it says, and then we'll come back to this and we'll start our airspace lesson. Okay, so what I have here for you is the CFI PTS, the most current one at the time of this recording, which is the CFI PTS, which changes 1 through 6. And this is what it's wanting for me to talk about on the practical test, or what we say demonstrate instructional knowledge of these items. And that is the basic VFR weather minimums for all classes of airspace. So I have to talk about the basic VFR weather minimums for all classes, and then I need to talk about each airspace. And these are your airspaces you're going to talk about. And I have to talk about the operating rules, pilot certification, airplane equipment requirements, and I want to make sure that I absolutely cover those at a minimum. Am I going to cover other things? Sure I am, but at a minimum, that's what I'm going to cover. I also need to cover special use airspace and temporary flight restrictions, and that is going to be on my second airspace lesson that I do, because I don't want to blow my students' head, like I said, off their shoulder. I want to make sure that they have a good understanding, and I'm not going to try to put 10 pounds of crap in a 5-pound bag on day one. So let's look now at the ACS and see what it wants us to know as a private pilot and as a commercial pilot. All right, so what you're looking at here is the private ACS. So for a private pilot, in addition to what you have to know for the test for the CFI PTS, you should also be able to talk about this information as well. And if we look at the top here and compare it to what we were doing at the CFI, it says the types of airspace, airspace classes, and associated requirements and limitations, chart symbology, special use airspace, CFRAs, TFRs, and other airspace areas. And along the way, I'm going to be talking about the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risk with the various classes and types of airspace. And then I must be able to demonstrate as a private pilot the ability to identify and comply with the requirements for basic VFR weather minimums and flying in particular classes of airspace, correctly identify airspace and operate in accordance with associated communication and equipment requirements, and identify the requirements of operating in SUA or within a TFR, identify and comply with SATR and SAFRA operations. Now, here's where a lot of CFIs go wrong. They look at the PTS, but they don't bounce the private and the commercial ACS along with it, and they will end up leaving out things like the CFRA, like the Special Flight Rules area that we have like in DC. And that is a problem, because then the examiner will start to ask about these questions. They'll say, okay, can you tell me about a SATR or a SAFRA? And the person will say, I've never heard about that. I didn't see it in the PTS. I didn't know I had to know that. But remember that this is the official assessment tool for a private pilot, and so you have to know that. Let's bounce over to the commercial pilot and see what it says. You can see here that it's literally the same exact thing, almost word by word, except at the top it talks about commercial pilot stuff. But either way, you can see the knowledge area stuff here is a CA instead of a PA for private. But it's literally the same exact thing. So a private pilot and a commercial pilot has to know the same thing in regards to airspace. Now that we have our CFI material ready, we have our airman certification for private, airman certification for commercial. We've looked that over. Now we can go ahead and start, because now I have a good idea about how I'm going to present this. One of the things that are in the ACS that's not in the PTS is charting symbology, the types of airspace, uncontrolled and controlled. We show all the classes in the PTS, but we don't talk about the types of airspace. And then down here at the bottom where it talks about the SAFRAs and the SATRs. So you want to make sure you blend those into your conversation. Let's bounce back over to SkyVector and see how we're going to present this. Okay, so I've just sat down with my student. The night before, I've given them a homework assignment. The homework assignment is going to be for them to look over maybe a chapter or some pages, or maybe I have some printouts for them, but I'm going to give them something to review prior to coming to class. And I want to make sure that as a pro CFI, that I actually have that on my lesson plan. So besides just having the standard layout of a lesson plan, on my lesson plans, I have homework or either pre-work, which is done prior to class, that they must look over, so that way I don't have to go into mega details. I can say, do you remember talking about this, reading this last night? Yeah. Did you understand that? Yes. All right, well, let me just amplify it a little bit more. I don't have to go into as much detail. It makes my job a little bit easier. It also tells me what kind of student I'm dealing with. So I'm going to start off here on Ashland, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit further. So what I'm going to look at here in regards to this airport is I need to be able to tell them how to read chart symbology. So I want to start talking about this airport, and I don't, like I said, I don't go A, B, C, D. I start off with class G, and I go with that. So right here is where I say to them, imagine that all across the United States of America, from sea to shining sea, sea to shining sea, from the highest mountain to the lowest valley, that there is a sheet cake. And this sheet cake, we're going to bake it all across the United States, and it's approximately 1,200 feet AGL high. So it's 1,200 foot off the ground. As a brand new student, I'm going to have to explain what AGL and MSL is. I'll abbreviate this in this lesson here that I'm going with you, because you already know what it is. So I'll just say, I'm going to go ahead and explain to them what AGL is. I'm not going to explain it to you. And then I say, within this 1,200 foot zone is where all the airports lie. And because we don't have any airports that that are above ground level, they don't have any that's in the sky, so it's all attached to the surface. So we're going to have everything on the surface, and from the surface up 1,200 feet all the way across the United States, from sea to shining sea, from the highest mountain to the lowest valley, 1,200 foot AGL all the way across the United States. And everything within this 1,200 feet and below, we're going to refer to as uncontrolled airspace. Now, it's really good in this uncontrolled airspace because there's not a lot of rules. As a matter of fact, you can really just kind of think about, if you're operating within 1,200 feet, that you can just go for it, because there's no rules within this area. And you'll find a lot of airplanes within this area, like people flying ultralights and other kind of aircraft, and non-certificated pilots flying experimental type things. You're going to find a lot of garbage down within this G. So go for it, or garbage. I want you to think about this as class G airspace, because it's uncontrolled. The FAA doesn't control this airspace, and you can basically just do what you want to do. Now, this airport, Ashland, lies within that airspace, and there's some information that we can talk about this airspace that we have to know as pilots. So this airport sits within that class G airspace, and it is called Ashland Lineville. And the FAA puts a little identifier past it. Now, that little identifier is very important, because we don't know how many Ashland airports there are in the United States or in the world. And we just can't say Ashland, because we don't know whether it's Ashland, Alabama, or Georgia, or Carolina. So we look at these little identifiers they put past it. In this particular case, this airport is called 26 Alpha. And if I wanted to put that in my GPS, I want to go to 26 Alpha, it would take me directly to that airport. So every airport has an identifier. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about what the 1065 means, what the asterisk means, what the L means, what the 40 means, and how we drop the 2 zeros, and the CTAF frequency of 122.9. And then I'm going to ask the person to go ahead and say, look, now I've told you, can you go ahead and just give me a read back of this? And I'll have them read me back that line, and I'll say, great. Now, then let's take a look at the bump up from that. So one thing I can probably deduce from this airport is that the next stage of your training after private is instrument. And one thing that's cool about instrument is you can arrive into an airport without actually seeing the runway, without even seeing the airport. So you're going to be coming through the clouds. And normally you can see that an airport has an approach that comes into it when it looks like this. And so this is this airport. It is Sylacauga. They call it Merkel, but everybody calls it Sylacauga. And this airport has this magenta shaded ring around it, and it's magenta, it's not purple. Okay, you gotta make sure they know that it's magenta. And then I'm going to start talking about that. And now I'm going to say, look, so because this one has an air approaches into it, ATC wants to have more control over the airports. So we're going to take that 1,200 foot and we're going to lower it. So I want you to imagine that you had a cookie cutter. And you took your cookie cutter and you went over the top of this airport into that cake, and you cut that part of that cake out, and you knocked it down an additional 500 feet. So whenever you see this magenta ring, we went from outside here at 1,200, and right there at the edge of that ring, it goes straight down 500 feet and levels off. So basically you went from 1,200 all the way down to 700, and that 700 goes all the way across to the other side, and I'm all the way to the other side of the field. Let's see if I can get back on my airport there. Yep, so it goes. So that 700 goes all the way across to the other side of the airport, way over here, and that gives me the air traffic controller more control. Now let's look at this airport data and let's talk about this. And now I'm going to talk about more material that's added as the airports get more complex. And I'm going to say, now this reads exactly like it did over at Ashland, but we're going to add a couple of more things. And I'm going to talk about the airport name and the identifier. And then I'm going to say this one has weather. And we use this acronym here, which is Automated Weather Observation System. And it is a 3 is the AWOS 3, and it is a PT, which means part-time. It's not on all the time. But if I wanted to listen to it on 19.125 on the radio, I could, but I don't know what time it is. So this is where I would bring out my chart supplement. I would open it to Sylacauga, and I would show them what the applicable times were for the AWOS at Sylacauga. This gives me a chance to bring in the other data and to blend it in, so that way, from scratch, they're seeing how these things are used together. So if we're looking at a particular airport, they understand that in front of them, they're going to have a certain amount of tools to do this, and one of them is going to be the chart supplement. And then again, it would also give you a chance to either tab this out if it's an airport you're going to go to a lot, etc., whatever you're going to use it for. And then I would go through and I'd say, now tell me what this means, see if you can remember from the last time. And then I would let them stumble through that, and there you go. So now I'm going to take it to the next level, and I'm going to bump right up here, and you can see why I love this particular one here. I go right here to this area at Anniston. And then so I say, look, so over here next to lay-in intersection here, and we'll talk about that later on. I haven't got to that with you on this lesson because there's a lot of stuff on this chart that we have to learn. Over here, that's at 1,200 feet is the top of that the bottom of the controlled, or you can say the top of the uncontrolled. And then when we get to the magenta shaded, we drop down another 500. But then this airport has a tiny or thin magenta, not to be confused with this very thick magenta. That's something else. But we have a thin magenta here, and that's going to slam that controlled airspace all the way down to the ground, okay? So first off, we're going to talk about this controlled airspace that we didn't talk about on Sylacauga. So when you are looking at airspace, what is controlled and what is uncontrolled, we're going to learn about different types of airspace today. We're going to talk about A and B and C and D and E and G. So we just talked about G, and the way to understand what is E is it's everything that is not D, C, B, or A. If it's not D, C, B, or A, and it's uncontrolled, well, it's Class E. So everything else or elsewhere is going to be E. And as we jump in and start talking about those other airspaces, you can see what I'm talking about here, but we've got to start here at the basics. Then I would open up my chart supplement because this Anniston Airport has a lot of good conversation points to it. And I would go over it here and I would say, okay, what is this and what is this ANB and what is this ASOS and what's the difference between ASOS and AWOS? That's a good time to kind of bring that up. And with the frequency, and is it open 24 hours? And then here's the 612 pilot controlled lighting, 7,000 feet, 123 nothing. And 123.6. And then we'll look at this other thing here, right pattern for runway Fife. And I want to go over this information with them, and that's going to get us past this uncontrolled area, or basically getting into, the Gulf and the Echo. So now I've talked about Ashland. I went from Ashland over to this one, and I'm adding one little thing every time. That's the reason why the order that I'm telling you is the most correct order to actually teach it. Now I want to go to the next airspace. So I've got to find me another airspace that is the next up, and that is the Delta. So I just come right across over here. Let's see here. The one that I like to use is Columbus. Here it is. And so I come right over here and I say, you can see here, and I just test them as I'm going. And I would say, what is the top of the Gulf right in here? And I would see what they say. And I'd say, what is the top of the Gulf right in here? And I would see what they say. And I'd go, now, some of them have this blue dashed. So as I'm coming in here from this area and I'm flying through here and I'm at this altitude, what airspace would I be in? Yes, that's correct. I'd be in this airspace. And then what happens right here? And they would tell me that it drops down 500 feet there. And I'd say, okay, good. And then I'd say, oh, let's talk about this airspace. And then I would go into talking about what Class D airspace is. And I don't have to use this military installation here. I could use Columbus is fine. You can just see this blue ring a lot better there, but it doesn't matter. Whatever airport you want to use, this is not an airport they can land at, and that's something that also I would go over as well. But this, you can see how busy Columbus is. That's the reason why, for conversational purposes, I just chose to use Lawson Army Airfield here for conversation purposes. So you know what? Let's not get confused. Let's go up to another airport, which is a little bit easier to talk about. We'll just use Athens right here, and it's not as busy as Columbus. So then I want to start talking to them about the entry requirements to come into this controlled airspace. And I want to start off by telling them about how this airport is blue. And that is different between the other airports we looked at because they are magenta. And so blue means that it has a controlled tower field on the airport, or a controlled tower on the airport, sorry. So as I'm coming in here, what do I got to do to get into their airspace, which is different from the last airport that we talked about? Well, in this particular one, I need to be able to talk to the tower and let them know that I'm coming into the airport. And I want to start about 10 miles out. This is also an opportunity where you can go to the regulations and you can blend in regulations in Part 91. You can also go to the AIM and show them about the entry requirements. It's entirely up to you about how much detail you want to go into, but just to let you know, it's only the regs and only the AIM. You could bring in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, but it doesn't go into much detail as the AIM. But in the check ride, you simply just want to tell the examiner, I would then go to the AIM, or I would then go to the regs, and I would blend that in. You don't need to talk about everything in detail. They're not requiring you to do that. They simply just want to know how you're going to teach it. So what I do is I say, in order to go in here, I have to be able to talk to the tower, and I cannot go beyond this blue line here coming inbound to the airfield unless I've talked to them. And so what I must do prior to entering that airspace is establish a dialogue with the control tower. And then I go through and I tell them what that means. And I say, look, so if I say, hello tower, this is 435 Alpha, and I wait for a response, and then they say, aircraft calling, stand by, I have not established dialogue. So I would go through all the dialogue issues or the scenarios with them and tell them how to get into the airspace. And so because we have to establish a dialogue, I want you to call this airspace Class D. So I got to establish a dialogue. Now, where do we start establishing the dialogue? 10 miles out and no later before us getting to this blue line. We cannot go past this dashed blue line unless we've established dialogue. Now, with the other airports, airspaces that we looked at a minute ago, we talked about a lateral, but we didn't talk about a vertical dimension. So in this particular case, I'm going to go over these little hash box here and talk about the vertical dimensions of the airspace. And so I'd say this one right here goes out around 4.5 nautical miles or 5 statute miles, and it tops out at 3,300 feet MSL. And then I would explain MSL to them. And then I'm pretty much done with telling them about the airspace there. And again, when I go over the cards here in just a minute to tell your student what they need to know and how to create these as homework, you'll see how I'm going to blend all this stuff in together. So while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and review the shaded magenta. I'm going to review the dashed magenta, and I'm going to cover the airspace symbology, and I'm also going to ask them to go over this material here, Athens EPS Airport, AHANC TAF, Control Tower, 126.3, and so on, and to make sure they understand how to read that. And I'm blending is on, I'm adding something new every single time, okay? So hopefully they're tracking with me so far. As always, if I'm leaving anything out, you can just always ask me questions below. But again, I'm abbreviating this because I want you to know how to teach it. I'm not trying to tell you every fine, minute detail. So please don't leave comments telling me what I've left out. I know what I've left out. I've taught this for many, many years, and I'm just trying to tell you how to teach it. I'm not teaching you airspace. Please understand, I'm not teaching you airspace. I'm trying to teach you how to teach airspace. All right, now, once I've done that, I'm going to go over to the next one. So I'm going to scroll back over here, and I'm going to talk about the Class Charlie. Now, on the Class Charlie, I'm going to tell them that this is another blue airport, just like the last one, but this is rectangular. I'm going to go over what that means to 2 or more parallel runways or 8,069 foot or greater runway and blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to go and start talking about how this looks. And I'm going to say this looks like a soda can with a donut sitting on top of it. And so I would maybe draw it out sideways dimensionally on the board if I had to, or on a scratch piece of paper. But I would say from the side it looks like this, and then from the top it looks like this, and it's this heavy magenta lines. And we can also see that we have in here the shaded magenta. We also have a little bit of the dashed magenta that's coming in here, and that's really all of the commonality. We can try to find the name of the airport. So this one is Birmingham Shuttlesworth International, BHM, and there's some information. And if there's anything new, I just give them the new information as I'm going along. And eventually, when I'm going over the chart, I'm just going to have them lead it. I'm going to have them lead it, especially if you're in a ab initio program where you know that the private pilot you're training is going to be in the CFI program one day. You want to make sure they can go ahead and present this back to you, or maybe even teach it back to you, even at the private level. That's going to send them over the top on this check ride if they can actually do that. So once I go over the symbology, then I'm going to start talking about what each one of these little corridors mean and how the top is 46 and the bottom's 19. And it's different from over here at this one, which is 46 and 24. And the reason why that is, that's probably due to a rise in terrain or some other feature that's there where they have to lift the floor up a little bit. And I'll go over that. And then I'll start talking about what I have to enter it. And so if you remember before, I told you that in the first airport we had to have dialogue. Well, at this airport we still need dialogue. So we have to establish communication with them. Now the important part here is when to establish communication with them. So at this point I have to talk about this little white box here, or either this little white box here, and I have to go over the magenta waypoints over here, the magenta flag waypoints, and I have to talk about the waypoints. And I have to tell them that around 20 nautical miles, they have to think about talking to who? Is it the control tower? No, it's contact Birmingham approach within 20 nautical miles, within 20 nautical miles on that frequency, or that frequency if they're flying a military radio with UHF, which they're probably not. So once I go over that, then I tell them that they cannot go inside of this airspace unless they've established communication, because Class Charlie airspace controllers, they're very stuck up. They don't want anybody talking directly to them. You have to get introduced, and that's the reason why we're going to use approach control to let them know that we are approaching their airspace and we want to come into their airspace. So we call them approach control. Now, in addition to the communication or the dialogue that we talked about, they must be able to also see how high our aircraft is. And we do that by using our transponder inside the airplane. At this time is where I would talk about transponders. And then I would talk about the different modes of transponders, like mode A and mode C and mode S. And maybe a very brief introduction to ADS-B, but I mean ultra brief, because we don't want to get too incredibly saturated on outside of airspace stuff. So I'd say the minimum mode that we need, the minimum of the modes, would be mode C. And we want to make sure that our airplane is equipped with ADS-B out, and we'll talk about that when we look at the logbooks for the aircraft and the POH to make sure that we understand, is this airplane equipped with ADS-B? Because you're also going to show them in the logbooks, the maintenance logbooks, how to know if the airplane's equipped with ADS-B out. That's a thought for another lesson, or if you have specific questions, I can answer that. But looking at the logbooks, looking at the pilot operating handbook, and looking for the additions, the 337s and things that's been added to the airplane, the STCs, those are very big for finding whether or not this airplane has had ADS-B installed. So I'm going to tell them that the minimum I need is C. So I tell them, in order to enter this airspace, you need D plus C. So you need dialogue plus mode C transponder. So we're going to call this Class C airspace, and then I'm going to tell them how it's usually written right up here, what the airspace is. And then after that, I can move up to the next airspace. And so I say we talked about G, we talked about E. If you wanted to, you could tell them why there's no F. We don't use F in the United States. And then you're going to talk about D, and then C, and then now we're getting even bigger. So we're going to come over here, we're going to talk about big, blue, and busy, and big. And this is Atlanta. So if we're looking at it from the outside here, we're going to try to fly into this airspace. Let's look and see what the airspace looks like. How do we recognize it on our chart? Well, it's big, and it's blue solid lines. and it has a lot of stuff in there. And this airport right here is very, very big. And if we'll start from the middle and work our way out. So this is Hartsfield-Jackson International, and here's all this stuff. And you're going to go over that with them. And then you're going to just branch yourself out from the middle. You're going to say it goes from the surface up to 12,500 feet. And then as we get further out, 2,500 up to 12,005, and so on and so on. And then you're going to talk about what you need to enter the airspace. So this airspace, we're going to continue our trend. So we need D plus C plus we need to be cleared. So once we establish communication and we have our transponder on and we know it's ADS-B out, then we have to talk to them and we have to hear the words November 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you are cleared to enter Bravo airspace, and that will allow us to go in that. So what do you need to enter D? Dialogue. What do you need to enter C? You need D plus C. What do you need to enter B? You need D plus C plus B cleared. And see how you're building onto the building blocks with every single thing that you add forward. Hopefully I'm not boring you with this. But this is the very proper way to teach this. And then you're going to talk about all the extra stuff with the Bravo, like the Mode C veil, and how the Mode C veil goes from the surface up to 10,000 feet and goes 30 nautical miles out from the VOR, not from the center of the airport. And we know that because we can see the airspace up here doesn't align with the Mode C veil, even though this is a 30 nautical miles out from the airport, and that's a 30 nautical mile Mode C. And you look around here, you can see how it matches up there, but then it gets off. Let's see here, it gets off a little bit. You see how it gets off there? That's the reason why, because one's taken from the VOR, like a DME, and the other one's taken from the center of the airport, like a GPS coordinate. So the airspace is taken from the GPS dead center of the airport, where the geodetical survey plate is located, and then the Mode C veil is DME. Now that I've talked about all those airspaces, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about the VFR weather minimums. And I'm going to tell them, I say, look, for almost all airspaces that we have, we as VFR pilots, we just can't go and fly in any weather. So we need a minimum of 3 statute mile visibility. And we need a minimum of 1,000 foot ceilings. And we have to separate for ourselves from the cloud at 152, so 1,000 foot above, 500 foot below, and 2,000 foot from it. I don't know why it's doing like. I always remember like I was, some military thing, like you're out in the field and you're like, like running around or something. I don't know. It's kind of weird to me, but that's how I kind of remembered it. And then you're going to talk about that. And then you're going to say, all right, so for the Echo, for the Delta, for the Charlie, that's all 3152, doesn't matter day or night. And that's going to be all good as long as you're below 10,000 feet. If you're in the Echo, above that, we'll talk about that in a second because I'm going to segregate that from all the 3152 stuff. But then I'll say, now if you're in Charlie, it's a little bit different. We're going to stick with the 3 statute miles, but we're just going to limit this, so it'll be 3 statute miles, 1,000 foot ceilings, and now we just must maintain clear of the clouds. So we can go right up next to a cloud, but we have to maintain clear of the cloud. We can't go into the cloud. We can get a little bit closer in Bravo, but we got to stay just clear of the clouds in the Bravo. The most difficult one to talk about, I think, is the class Golf to talk about. So I just want to sit down with them. I have like a little chart thing sometimes I like to use. Some of you may use the airspace VFR weather minimum triangle, and that's perfect. So however you want to teach that class Golf airspace weather minimums is up to you. I know how I teach it, but I'm not trying to push a specific way onto you. So however you want to teach that is fine. And then we've talked about the VFR weather minimums and cloud clearances. Then I can actually say that this chart only goes up to 18,000 feet MSL, but there's another airspace above it. But you as a private pilot with no instrument rating, you can't go up there. That's called Class A airspace. And so that's way up there in altitude. So When you think of Class A, I want you to think of altitude. And so in order to go into there, and then I'm going to tell them, you got to be IFR, your plane's got to be IFR, you got to be talking ATC, you got to be on an IFR flight plan, blah, 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 blah. Give them all the A data. And then I'm going to say, look, you can write that down on your little note card that I'm going to have you create tonight for homework. But remember that you can't go up there as a private pilot unless you have attained your instrument rating and you have a clearance, and you got to have all those requirements to go up there. And so now I have done the very first part in regards to what I need to talk about with the airspace. I've covered some symbology. I've covered the airspaces that they want me to on the CFI PTS. I've met all the requirements for that. And I've talked about the entry requirements. And I've literally talked about everything that I need to talk about in regards to the different types of airspace. And I've also blended in chart symbology, all right? So this allows the examiner to kind of, if they want to query me on some things, they may ask me like, okay, what is this or what is that? And I go, that's a tower. And okay, why does this one have why does this thing have a number there and a number in parentheses? And you can tell them, say, look, 1,360 feet, that's what my altimeter would read when I hit the top of the tower, and then that number underneath it is how far I would fall to the ground after I hit the tower. So that's the way I teach my students, however you want to teach yours. Now, in the addition to, let's go back to the Flight Instructor PTS, you can see that I have to talk about SUA and TFRs. So again, this is where I'm going to be going back to and showing them in the regs where this is. If every time I'm teaching something, I always want to have my regs open, because I want to have a reg reference to everything I'm talking about, so that way they don't think that the regs are like some crazy weird crap, all right? And that's not the case. That's not the case. Everything's located within the regs, so there's always a reference for anything. Talking about a medical, 6123. Talking about how to sign their logbook, 6151. Talking about how to stay current, 6157. You know, whatever it is you're talking about, there's always some type of reg, something that you can name, so you always want to blend something in as far as regulatory guidance. 6191 really helps them to understand how that works their way in. At this point, I could make the jump over to special use airspace, and I would just literally start at the top of my acronym, whatever acronym you want to use. I have seen many different type of acronyms, MC, PRON, or whatever, but please make sure that you only talk about those airspace that are considered special use airspace. A lot of people talk about airspace that is not special use airspace, like a controlled firing area or something like that. So you only want to talk about the ones that are actually labeled as a special use airspace. So what I do with there is I just go and I start finding special use airspace. Again, this is something that I've already pre-programmed out in my head. So I'll go over here, I'll talk about all the different ones. I'll talk about a MO, I'll talk about a restricted. I'll go over to the coast because I've got to go over to water to talk about warning, because warnings are over water, they're never over land. Its sister is over land, that's restricted area, invisible, often unseen hazards, and that's their restricted and warning. So, you know, and then I can go over all of the special use airspace to include the SFRA and SATR, SATR and SAFRA requirements. So I would go up to, on a digital chart, I would go up to the DC area, and I would go ahead and go over the SAFRA and the SATR requirements as I am stalling to get up there. Norfolk, we are almost there. And let's see, here we go. Now we're getting into it. So I would go over this stuff right here and let them know what they need to look at in regards to this area here. All right, and the training and all these white boxes over here. And would you need to talk about this up front? No. If you're training someone out of one of these airports around in this area, yes. But not pre-solo. This is like your lesson 2 airspace that you want to talk about it with. In the airspace, you probably just want to abbreviate, saying, look, when I get ready to teach SAFRA and SATR, I'm going to show them this chart and I'm going to talk about it. That's it. You know, the special, you got to go online, do the special training. got to pay attention to all these white boxes around here, and that's it. Don't make it complicated. And then the last thing is to go to TFRs. Again, go to the regs, pull out the TFR regs, go over the different type of TFRs with them, and then show them how there is not really effective. Well, actually, this is a great one here because you can actually see that this is actually a TFR here. And I can't actually show it to you because it'll move as I'm moving along. But if you find a TFR, you can do that, which it works out great, and you can go over that with them and show them how that works. And you say, look, we got presidential TFRs and national disaster TFRs and all the other different types of TFRs. And you're pretty much done. And that's how you're going to teach airspace. And to me, that's so incredibly simple. And then to top it off and to make it like you're going to punch through way over the top if you do with this, what I'm about to tell you. Now you're going to talk about the risk management aspect to it. When you blend risk management into it, oh my God, man, the examiner is going to, they're just going to like pass you on the check ride right there. They're going to, yeah, okay, well, I don't need to see you fly. You're done. You passed. Not really, but not a lot of instructors do that because they can't seem to think like an instructor. So then you can go back to your private pilot ACS and you can write some of these risk management things, scenarios into your lesson plan. So that way when you're talking to your student, you can say, now look, what do you think the problem would be if I was unable to identify that I was flying into this airspace? What do you think the risk would be with me not knowing that I was flying into this? And there it is right there. Applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risk encompassing various classes and types of airspace. So what would happen if I flew into a restricted or a warning or a MOA or blah, blah, blah? Very simple. Okay, blend that risk management in on everything that you're doing and you'll be fine. Now, the next thing is the homework that I'm going to give them at night. And that is, I'm going to have them create some little cards like this. And so what I do here is I just have them put together some very specific pieces of information on the card. And hopefully that worked out right. But I'll put the format for it in the notes below. So that way, if you couldn't see this for some reason, exactly how I do that here. Anyway, this is what I have to give them for homework. There are some AOPA flashcards that you can get them to like go and print out or something like that or utilize digitally. But again, the more the 5 senses that they use, so if they use their touch or their skin, which is however you want to say it like that, you know, eyes, mouth, tongue, or eyes, tongue, hearing, and their skin, which is how something feels. It may be touch, it may be something else, but something's touching their skin somewhere, but they know by touch. So you want to be able to use that touch and have them write things out. So they're seeing it, they're touching it, they're hearing it. And I simply just start from the top down and I say, look, I want you to do a little note card and you're going to, at the top, write the name of the airspace. And then after that, you're going to tell me how it, what are the dimensions of the airspace. And then I want you to tell me how does it appear on a sectional chart. And then I want you to tell me the VFR weather minimums. And then I want you to tell me what you need to enter the airspace. And then you can put little caveats on there like the regulatory guidance. Like if you want to tell them that like Class Bravo or something, you can say, oh, I want you to know that the Class Bravo is a 91.131. Maybe not have them memorize it, but at least have them write it on their card so they have it at their fingertips. So they don't think that the regs are like this weird thing that they don't need to know. And then I always like to talk about airspeed limitations and then any other special limitations like the Bravo. I talk about the mode CVL, ADSB requirements, things like that. Once you do that, you're done teaching the airspace. You can see this whole entire project here took me very close to an hour, but you can get it down less than that if you abbreviate it. I'm doing a lot of other talking things, but I'm going to put how I do all this stuff down into the notes. I'm kind of like a recap what I'm talking about. And you just go from like the basic core airport all the way up to the top of the airport. Now, hopefully, this is really going to help you to make a great Airspace presentation. If you have any questions whatsoever, please make sure you ask the questions and I will answer those and follow up. I am going to try to do one of these per week. If you have suggestions, please make sure you send them to me. I'm working on about 6 other suggestions right now. As when I'm finished this one, go on to some more recommendations. But please let me know what you want to see, because I'm actually getting to a point now where I've talked about a large amount of things, and I'm going to start getting into some of the maneuvers and some of the technical subject areas. So I'm Todd Shelnut with CFI Pro Courses. I hope that you enjoyed this introduction on how to teach airspace. It's not all inclusive because I want you to have your own little spill on it, and I don't want you to try to be a copycat of me. Please let me know if I can help. I look forward to seeing you again. Take care.